This is the story of a genre-defining video game born from the mind of one of Capcom's brightest young talents. Fueled by imagery and influenced by legends such as George Romero and Stephen King. A game that was almost too powerful for the hardware of the time. A game that would shatter records across the world. And a game that would coin the term survival horror. This is the history of Resident Evil for the Sony PlayStation. Horror video games in the early 80s and 90s were not the popular mainstream genre that they are today. One of the earliest examples of a horror game can be seen in the 1982 classic Haunted House by James Andreessen, published by Atari for the 2600 home console. The Atari 2600 would have a few other horror games, notably 1983's Texas Chainsaw Massacre by Wizard Video Games and Halloween, also in '83 by Wizard, programmed by Tim Martin. Throughout the 1980s, there were a few notable horror games released that earned cult status, but never really broke through to mainstream pop culture. In 1989, veteran Capcom developer Takeru Fujiwara created a horror-based role-playing game for the Nintendo Famicom called Sweet Home. Fujiwara had been at Capcom since the early 80s and helped develop some of Capcom's biggest hits to date, including Bionic Commando, Ghosts and Goblins, and Commando, just to name a few. Sweet Home is often credited as laying the groundwork for today's survival horror games. It's a role-playing game that takes place in a mansion. You take control of 5 playable characters who can venture out solo or in teams of 2 or 3. With a twist, the game has permanent deaths. Once a character is killed, they are gone forever. Sweet Home encourages exploration, inventory management, and fighting or fleeing your encounters. There is a ton of puzzle solving and backtracking that all make their way into Resident Evil.
The few friends I have call me Carnby.
In 1992, the horror game genre would change forever with the release of Alone in the Dark by Infogrames for MS-DOS. There was also a CD-ROM version. Game director Frederick Raynal set out to create an H.P. Lovecraftian story that focused on 2 characters exploring an old haunted mansion, Emily Hartwood and Edward Carnby. For separate reasons, they are tasked to explore the mansion known as Derceto. Once entering the mansion, they cannot escape and need to figure out a way through grueling puzzles and scavenging for items that will help them along in their quest to escape and survive. What set Alone in the Dark apart from the other horror games at the time, first, was the graphical achievements. The backgrounds were pre-rendered while the characters, enemies, and objects you could interact with were all polygons. The story was told through voice acting, which was still fairly new at the time. Each book you picked up in the mansion further propelled the eerie tale forward and was narrated for you.
Perseus came across Ikios, who had been turned into stone.
The game was centered around exploration and not holding your hand. Players would really have to think and go through the books that lined Derceto's halls for clues to the game's many puzzles. Raynal really created something special with this game, and the importance and influence of Alone in the Dark cannot be understated. Another noteworthy game that should be credited for making horror games more mainstream is Trilobite's 1993 full-motion video puzzle horror game, The Seventh Guest. Published by Virgin Interactive Entertainment. The game is known for its show-stopping full-motion video graphics and NPC encounters that are fully voice-acted.
Why? Because it's a spooky old house? Don't worry, dear. I'll watch out for you.
This game made you feel like you were a part of the story. The full-motion video was really the future of gaming and a product of the CD-ROM landscape at the time. The puzzles in The Seventh Guest were taken to the next level, and solving each one was always a huge accomplishment. In 1993, Shinji Mikami was tasked in creating a new horror game for Capcom that would loosely be based off Fujiwara's early Famicom game, Sweet Home. Shinji Mikami started working at Capcom in 1990 with games like Goof Troop and Aladdin under his belt. He was now put in charge of Studio 4, otherwise known as Team Horror by Fujiwara. It was now their job to bring this horror-themed adventure to life on the new PlayStation hardware. Production started on Biohazard, a horror-themed game that would revolve around a mansion similar to Sweet Home, and the player would be trapped in the house until they solved all the puzzles and could then escape. The original story for Resident Evil was based on a story that Mikami learned about in school called Yotsuya Kaiden, which is arguably the most popular Japanese ghost story ever written. This story, wrote in 1727, is a ghost story about a woman who seeks revenge on her husband. This story would be the starting point for Mikami and the story of Resident Evil. However, after starting work in the game, the decision was made to turn the enemies into more creature-like beings, as it would be easier from a story perspective to explain that over fighting ghosts. In junior high, Mikami watched George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, and it really stuck with him. He liked that the characters in the film would struggle and often make wrong choices to him. How they would always have to choose to run or to fight. He wanted to add the same kind of choice system that he saw in Dawn of the Dead to the game. Mikami was also influenced by the 1974 Tobe Hooper movie, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The characters in the film enter a scary house and all of a sudden are struck with fear at the sight of Leatherface appearing out of nowhere. Mikami has said that the design of the hunters and how they suddenly appeared was the direct influence of the Leatherface character. Stephen King's story The Shining was also a huge influence, specifically the way the Overlook Hotel looked in the Stanley Kubrick film. Mikami was also a huge fan of Alone in the Dark. It helped him envision the kind of game that he wanted to create. Originally, Resident Evil was not going to be a fixed perspective game, but a first-person one. But due to the limitations of the PlayStation hardware, this would have been a huge risk to pull off. After seeing the pre-rendered backgrounds of Alone in the Dark, Mikami decided to go that route. He thought the fixed camera views and tank controls would make the game even scarier. The player would move from screen to screen not knowing who or what was waiting for them, always keeping them on their toes. There were a few ideas Mikami had that were ultimately scrapped for the final game. One being the ability to switch weapons and items without having to go to the menu. A full co-op mode was also going to be in the game, but was ultimately cut. And as stated earlier, the infamous first-person mode that may have made its way into other Resident Evil projects. Resident Evil was the first horror game to coin the term survival horror. Besides the ghastly enemies you must face throughout the different sections of the game, there are many strategic gameplay elements that make the game unique. The inventory management carried out from Sweet Home is one gameplay mechanic that really adds to the overall tension of the game. Unlike Alone in the Dark, where items can be dropped anywhere, Resident Evil relies on chests that are spread out, making every item that you pick up a tough choice. Inventory space is limited, with Jill having 8 slots and Chris only having 6. Weapons and health are scarce, and with every enemy encounter, your first instinct might be to just start blasting away. This isn't always the best course of action, however. The last thing in this game you want to happen is to run out of ammo. Saving the game also needs to be strategic, as there is only a certain number of ink ribbons, which are found and used on typewriters, spread throughout the game. If your character dies, it's game over. Right back to the title screen, leaving you with no choice but to load your last save. The Spencer Mansion is laid out like a giant maze with many hallways, secret passages, and doors that are often locked. When you can't get into a door, a hint is given at which key is needed to open that door. This leaves the player taking many mental notes, as backtracking to previous areas is a core component to Resident Evil's gameplay. Different weapons and ammo types can be found, leaving with them their own set of challenges. Great! I found the grenade launcher, but should I use it now on these tough enemies, or save it for later down the road? These choices the player has to make is one of the best components of Resident Evil. While the game itself is known for being survival horror, I also like to think of it as a giant puzzle game. Each item has a specific use and somewhere it needs to be taken. Again, there's a ton of mental notes that need to be taken, not only with keys and items, but what rooms still need to be checked. The traditional puzzles are also a ton of fun and have just the right amount of challenge without derailing the pace of the game. The visuals of the game are horrifying, from the long hallways to the small claustrophobic rooms to the sterile cold feel of the labs. The atmosphere is all tied together with one of the greatest horror scores ever written for a game, and that is all thanks to the composers Makoto Tomozawa, Koichi Hiroki, and Masami Ueda. Mikami's finished story for Resident Evil is nothing short of legendary. The game takes place in July 1998 in the Arklay Mountains near Raccoon City, where a series of bizarre murders have been reported. Victims are found partially eaten, hinting at something not human. Raccoon City's elite police force, STARS, which stands for Special Tactics and Rescue Service, sends out Bravo Team to investigate. They go missing. So Alpha Team, including series staples Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, are sent in next. Alpha Team gets attacked by monstrous dogs, the Cerebrus, and seeks refuge in a nearby mansion. They soon realize the mansion is anything but safe. Inside, they find the place crawling with zombies, mutated animals, deadly traps, and many clues about the sinister corporation behind it all, Umbrella. The Spencer Mansion is actually a front for a secret laboratory where Umbrella has been doing illegal bioweapons research. Now, the original Star Squad featured Beam Mercurio, who would later become Chris Redfield, Jill Morrison, who would become Jill Valentine, Dewey, and Gelzer. Originally, the STARS team would travel together following the player. That idea was once again changed due to technical limitations. However, traces of this can still be seen in the finished game with Barry and Jill's campaign and Rebecca and Chris's. Another change that was made is the character of Gelzer, who was a giant and had cybernetic implants, giving him an Incredible Hulk kind of a look, was turned into Barry and given a more realistic, down-to-earth design. Dewey was another character cut out completely. He was to serve as the comic relief, but was cut out due to the comedy downplaying the severity of the situation the player was in. Only 2 characters were now playable. Chris Redfield was designed by Mikami and fellow team designer Azeo Oishi. Chris served in the United States Air Force before he joined the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, a special operations unit of the Raccoon City Police Department. He is described as, and I quote, the blunt, tough guy type. In-game, Chris doesn't start with a gun. He has a smaller inventory, but he can run faster and take more damage. Chris's support character is Rebecca Chambers. Jill Valentine has a background in the US military and is a former Delta Force operative. She is known for her expertise in bomb disposal and mechanical devices, earning her the nickname the Master of Unlocking. Jill has a bigger inventory, lockpick so she avoids small keys, and she starts with more health and ammo. To quote Mikami, I wanted to make sure Jill came off as a military professional. Jill's support character is Barry Burton. The Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil was created by George Trevor, an architect. He was commissioned by Oswald E. Spencer, one of the founders of the Umbrella Corporation, to design the mansion. Mikami's mansion perfectly captures not only the look, but the feel of Stanley Kubrick's vision. Quiet and ominous, you never know what's going to be lurking behind each door. Resident Evil was all but ready to be released. There was just one problem: the name. In Japan, the game was known as Biohazard, and the plan was to keep that same name for North America. There were, however, a few issues. The name Biohazard would not be able to be trademarked due to the 1992 game Biohazard Battle, created by Sega for the Genesis. There was also a rock band from New York named Biohazard. Because of this, Capcom needed a name change for North America. So Capcom ran an internal company-wide contest to find a name for their new horror game. The name Resident Evil was chosen. For the North American box art, Capcom went with Marvel Comics artist Bill Sienkiewicz, whose work with Moon Knight and the New Mutants series was well known. Finally, with everything in place, Resident Evil was released in North America on April 1st, 1996. In the US, the game had sold over 1 million copies release by September of 1996. By end of the year 1997, the game had sold more than 4 million units worldwide and was now known as a system seller. Publication-wise, Resident Evil was getting top scores from some of the greatest gaming magazines of the time. Electronic Gaming Monthly from May of 1996 saw reviewers Andrew, Mark, Mike, and Sushi X giving Resident Evil a score of 8, 9.5, 9, and 9 on page 30. Mark's 9.5 reads, "There have been a lot of anticipated releases for the PlayStation, but Resident Evil is by far the top on my list. The game plays similar to the Alone in the Dark series, but features nicely rendered graphics and extremely smooth animation. The element that really grabs a player here is fear. After trading blows with the first zombie, you'll quickly become hesitant to turn down any uncharted corridors in the mansion. As a serious gamer, I've had my share of kiddie games and have been waiting for a title just like Resident Evil. It has a great plot, an adult theme, and more action than you'll be able to deal with. Make sure to keep the lights on if you plan on playing this at night. Happy hunting!" Game Informer of March of 1996 on page 8 saw reviewers Andy, Rainer, and Paul give Resident Evil a 9, 9.5, and another 9.5. And GamePro magazine from April of 1996 saw reviewers Air Hendricks and Bruce Lee giving Resident Evil an average score of 5 out of 5 on page 62. Not for the faint of heart, Resident Evil possesses the PlayStation with a spectacular round of murderous monster mayhem. This terrifying tale leaves you quaking in your shoes, and its breathtaking graphics and riveting gameplay will lure you back time and again. Resident Evil is an industry-defining game that pushed, challenged, and changed the horror game genre forever. An influence that can still be felt and seen in today's horror games, and a series that continues to be Capcom's greatest franchise. I'm Jay Bartlett, and thank you for watching the history of Resident Evil.